Did you make a quick transition to formula and never look back? Or are you a first-generation immigrant whose family practices different postpartum care routines than where you currently reside? Whether these questions apply to you or not, the stories my guest Siricha shares today are important for all of us to hear. So many of us get caught up in what we are used to. We forget there is a whole world out there that might do things differently than us. Siricha is a first-generation U.S. immigrant, former tech executive turned entrepreneur and podcaster, with a passion for helping women grow their careers in a way that meshes with their whole lives, and a mom of 2 teenagers. Put on your thinking cap and get ready to learn something about yourself as you hear her story. When I began breastfeeding, I was blindsided by how difficult it was. I may have thought I was prepared, but having known only a handful of people who had ever breastfed and only seeing it up close from a couple of them, I had a huge learning curve. Since then, I've become a doula, a lactation consultant, and a childbirth educator. I'm your host, Lo Nigrosh, and I welcome you to the Milk Making Minutes, where we explore breastfeeding experiences through the lens of systemic barriers, so that you know your breastfeeding struggles are not your fault, and your triumphs really are the miracles you feel they are. Hi, Sirisha. Welcome to the Milk Making Minutes. I'm so glad you're here.
Thanks, Lo, for having me.
Yeah.
I'm so glad to connect over OSA and get to know you more.
I know. It's so great to connect with fellow podcasters who are making a difference in their fields of passion. And we'll get to hear all about that. But I have brought you here to discuss something that isn't something you normally talk about.
Very true. I do not talk about this at all.
Yeah. So before we get into talking about your baby feeding stories, I would just love to hear about you and your family and what you're up to.
Sure. Yeah, sure. So I'm originally from India. I came here for graduate school. I have 2 boys. So you're going to ask me these baby stories, which are going to be kind of a stretch because one is a senior and one's a sophomore. So heading off to college soon. So I'll have to really dig through my memories. And I used to be in tech. I worked as a tech exec for on and off for 15 years, taking career breaks when I had kids. And I just quit my corporate job recently. So I'm venturing out on my own between podcasting, radio shows, businesses, all sorts of things on a new
That's
path.
amazing. Yeah, good for you. Go be a girl boss.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It looks like it'll be fun. A lot of
Yeah.
learning and
Yeah, so you are definitely going to have to dust off some cobwebs here, but I believe you can do it. And you definitely do not have the oldest children of the podcast. I've had lots of guests with a wide variety of children. And as I was talking before we hit record, I do think hearing from people who have had children at different stages is really important because it shows us how far we've come and how far we still have to go. When you hear the same patterns emerge in the care that people receive in postpartum, either negatively or positively, then you think, okay, that's great. And then sometimes you think, oh my gosh, nothing has changed in 30 years in this particular area, or nothing has changed in 18 years in this particular area. Why are things moving so slowly? And it helps explain why some of us are still struggling so much to feed our babies.
yeah, very true. And it's not a conversation we often have, right? None of us even think to have it with our parents or grandparents or friends unless you're in that situation. And I think oftentimes when you're in that situation having a baby, and if you're one of the first in your set of friends, you don't have a network to go and ask. Or
Exactly.
you won't even think to ask those. So they're not always the most comfortable conversations to have either. So you're just kind of
Yeah.
conditioned not to talk about that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, you're often asking, if you do have people to ask, you're asking, what did you put on your baby registry? What kind of stroller did you buy? What kind of car seat should I get? But not these more intimate questions that impact us for years to come.
Yep.
Okay, I'm going to take you way back before you were having children. And I want to ask what your exposure to baby feeding was as a child, as a teenager, as you entered your 20s. What did you see when it came to baby feeding over the years?
As you're asking the question, I'm trying to think if I even encountered any babies along the way. And I have to say, From what I can think of, I would say the answer is no, because I think my cousins and friends around, there were not really any babies. I don't remember if I held any growing up. So I would say baby feeding stories probably, I don't recollect any. I know people got breastfed, and obviously there's a ton of research around it and stuff, but I cannot recollect anything. So it was probably all very new.
You grew up in India. When you think back to your childhood, if you're out in public, at a mall, at a restaurant, at a public square, at a public event, did you see people feeding babies with their bodies?
I wish I knew the answer to that question. I do not know. I was probably first one is I may not remember. Second is I probably wouldn't have noticed. You're at that age when you're not thinking about it. And I didn't India when I was there at that time was very different. No public malls, nothing like this. So I grew up in a big city in a small campus. So it was very, think of it like a university town. So it was very much a bubble. So I don't remember seeing anyone doing breastfeeding or anything. A lot of people were, most moms were stay at home moms. Few moms worked. So I'm sure it happened probably at home. A lot of people could have been joint families or nuclear families. So the family structure is different in some ways. So I don't really recollect. And I don't know what the conversation is. I think the conversation's changed quite a bit now from what I see on social media and things. And I think there's probably pockets of things which are incredibly liberal and pockets of things which are incredibly traditional. So I'm sure there's a big gamut of where and which part of the country you walk across.
Yeah. Okay. So then, as you were approaching starting your own family, thinking about having your children, did you have conversations with anyone in your family about what baby feeding was like for them as you were thinking about your options?
I probably had the conversation with my mother after I had the baby. So my mom was here when I had my kids. And I think you'll find that in a lot of probably Indian homes who are like first generation immigrant, that probably their parents are here or in laws are here often when they have their babies. And I know this is not exactly the question you asked me, but when you mentioned postpartum, I think that was a big significant thing. I realized after, because your parents are here for 3 months or 6 months, which I know is not the norm if you live here, it's very different experience, right? I think then you realize what that support system does for you, because I can totally see why postpartum happens, because it is so hard. It is think about it. During pregnancy you are the queen, you are feted like hand and foot and everything, and suddenly like the switch flips and then you're gone getting sleep, and everyone expects you to do everything, which is okay in a way but not also okay. And everybody's new. Even now at this age, I tell my kids sometimes, which I don't know is the best thing to tell, I tell them, hey, I'm on the job training as a parent. I don't know the answers. I'm learning, and we'll figure it out sometimes together. And especially as a new parent, you don't have any of the answers, and you get some from this doctor's office. My lactation experience wasn't very good. I couldn't do my feeding very well, and then the consultant was, I think the way it made me feel was, you don't know what you're doing or you're not doing it right. It's a guilt thing, right? It wasn't a good experience. And when you take your child up for the second, I think it's 2 week weigh in, and they're losing weight, and you're like worried
Mm,
about it, especially if it's your first one. I think by the second one you grow up and you know what to do. With the
mhm,
first one, you're like wondering. I switched very soon to a mix of formula and then formula very quickly. And I think
mhm,
that's where having my mom helped, having the conversation around what to do. It was okay to do it. There was like no stigma around it. Yeah, go ahead, because it was more important to feed the baby, because I myself, I think, was a preemie, so there was other challenges my mom had. So I think she was okay with all of that. And also the other thing, interestingly, is when I was going through this whole experience in India, traditionally there are certain foods they cook when the mom has the baby. For the first few days, there is a certain kind of diet to bring back strength, a certain type of vegetable, certain type of whatever lentils and all. I am a vegetarian, so around that, even my mother, like even like the sort of the habits, right? I My mother would make me tie this cloth around my waist, and it was not what you're thinking to hold the baby thing. No, it was for back support, because you
mm,
feel so weak, like your back cannot hold it. So that's what it was for. It was not about looking fit or trim. It was about getting strength. And then after, when the doctor said it was fine, she would make me do I don't remember what, maybe it was yoga or some kind of stretch exercise, just built to build the strength back, because your body doesn't have that strength. It's a little different, right? It's carrying this huge thing, and now it's your balance center of gravity has shifted. So in that sense, so she would cook certain foods at that time for all of that.
Yeah, I've definitely heard this before from other people from India that there is a certain pattern to that postpartum period that happens. And what a beautiful introduction into parenthood to have other people swoop in and take care of you. I've heard from some people that sometimes it can be a little much, especially if you want your independence. But I've
Mhm.
also heard that to have people cooking your meals for you and giving so much attention to you, like you said, that flip switches, that's such a beautiful metaphor. And suddenly you are just expected to still do all the dishes and wash all the laundry and change all the diapers and feed the baby, and you're getting so little sleep. And a lot of research indicates it takes a full year for the person who has given birth to recover, yet so many of us are not given that opportunity. So to have somebody come for 3 to 6 months and do so much of the care for you so that you can care for the baby is phenomenal.
Yeah, and I can totally see that there is a different dynamic when someone's staying with you for 3 to 6 months. So there's
Mhm.
definitely that. And it's around also the baby, by the way, gets special care. I
Mm.
don't know if I did everything that would normally be done, but they usually get like oil massages. There are certain ways they bathe them. So it's the growth and things. So there's a way of doing that care. Like my son would I probably have pictures, and because babies tend to get jaundiced also, right, very often, and I don't know if it was necessarily that, so you'd put him in the room where the sunlight would dapple him, and just there so he would get as much sun as he could. So every day for a few hours he would be sitting in that sun,
Mhm.
getting that. And to your point, when you're talking about the change, I mean, I my mother would say take a nap when the kid's sleeping, because you're never going to get sleep otherwise. But on the other side, and I talked about this on my own podcast, is for me, I love to read. And I guess now there are terms for all of this. There are coined terms for a lot of things we do, which we probably didn't have phrases for. I guess it's self-care, if that's the right term. I always read, and I used to stay up late, even as an exhausted mom, to read. And my mother would ask me, "Why are you doing this?" I'm like, "I need my space. I need my time. I needed that." And it was, whether it was intentional or not, I always did that, just I guess for my own sort of sanity, to feel that okay. Because you can be so lost, you can lose your identity in a way. You go to school, a lot of your friends are your kids' parents' friends. I just came back from a school event now, so you're so and so's mom or so and so's dad or so and so's parent or whatever, in whatever context, in which is good in ways, but also you lose your sense of identity. So how to retain that?
Yeah, even if it's just reading a book that you chose, that nobody else wants you to read, that it's just for you. Yeah.
Exactly. And it's not the usual, like you said, the chores part or the taking care of the baby or the house
Mhm.
or whatever, but it's
Mm,
you have your space to do what you want. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And for me, I had my father was also there and he helped too. And my in laws came. So it was both. So my
Mm,
in laws also were there to help and take care of my sons. So when they were
yeah,
there as well. And
yeah.
my father-in-law, I think, would pick him up, probably play with him when he was more playful. But yeah, it was there that they were there then when they were little.
Yeah, that's
Thought of them.
amazing. Okay, so I wanna bring you back a little bit to right when your babies were born. You can focus on one or both. I know you said particularly with the first, I don't know if it was with both, that you ended breastfeeding really quickly. Did you transition to formula within a couple of weeks for both of your kids?
Yes, and
Okay.
I'm from what I recollect, I think probably for the second one much quicker, because I had learned my lesson on the first one. I was
Okay.
going to give it my best shot, and then I wasn't going to wait to figure out, because the first one there was no guidance, right? So
Mhm.
I had to go to the doctor's office, figure it out. We tried a bunch of different things. From what I remember, you tried your best and you kept hoping it wasn't working, and then it was like, okay, you just have to feed the child. And then
Yeah.
the second one, I just pulled the trigger a lot quicker and said, okay, it's going to be both. And I pretty much went all formula. At that point, I was like, yes, I know it's good to do this, but if it's not easy to do it, then just move to formula.
And it's one thing for care providers to say, "This is good," and it's another thing for them to say, how can I help you to accomplish this? If this is what you want, where are the pain points? How is it difficult in a non-judgmental way, right? What are your goals around this? How can I help you to feed formula and to continue to provide human milk if that's what you want for your baby? There are ways to do that. I have heard from so many people who said, I will never see a lactation consultant again. They've had their first because I felt so judged when she kept pushing and pushing for me to continue something that wasn't working for my family. So, did you have any care providers like your OBGYN asking you what your plan was? Was there any prenatal education offered around breastfeeding that you remember?
I don't remember. I know I met the pediatrician before. They come into the hospital and do the checks and stuff. And I think they must have been consulting when you had the baby, obviously. And I remember the lactation consultant visiting a few days later. That's what I remember. I don't think the pediatrician's office provides that kind of info from what I remember. So there was not a lot of care. We might have gone even to somebody to visit once. The first few weeks, first few months, I for the my oldest especially, because it was like a learning process. We probably tried a bunch of things. And I did have a friend just before I had my son, because I was working at that point. I was finding out about pumps and things. So she helped me figure some of those things out. I had a room in the office and stuff because it was a challenging process for me. I think the support system is very critical. As new moms, as we were just talking about, the transition itself is so abrupt in some ways, though it feels like it's very smooth, it really is not. And there's so much, can be so much guilt and shame around it in a lot of ways. So every piece of support, even as casually said, can be quite hard because you think you should know everything, how to do everything, and really none of us know anything unless you've had encounters as a babysitter, you have siblings or somewhere or something that already is part of your nature. Most of us probably never encounter these situations, right? It's a very first time experience for most parents, I suspect.
Yeah, and feeding a baby from your own body. Even I was a nanny. I babysat from the time I could start babysitting. I thought that I was not going to be caught off guard as much as I was by parenting, but you can't prepare for feeding a baby from your body. And what we see is in cultures where it happens anywhere and everywhere out in the open, children from the moment they are born see other children feeding from their parents' bodies, and it's just like a part of the air. Those families have less difficulty feeding their baby. There are fewer breastfeeding struggles. Are you looking to have fewer human milk feeding struggles? I would love to support you wherever you are. Go to my linked website in the show notes, www.quabbinbirthservices.com. I can see you in person if you live in Massachusetts, Southern Vermont, or Southern New Hampshire, or virtually from anywhere. I can't wait to work together.
Hi, I'm Kanika, and you're listening to That's Total Mom Sense, the podcast, where I interview public figures on their life lessons in parenting, legacy, and built-in sixth sense.
Hey, what's up? I'm Kelly Rowland, and you're checking out That's Total Mom Sense.
Hi, this is Chelsea Clinton, and my experience on That's Total Mom Sense was fantastic.
It's me, Bobby Brown. Can't wait to share my story.
Thank you to my guests, brand partners, community, and you for making this show possible. Episodes released every Thursday wherever you listen to podcasts. You can join my tribe by logging on to that'stotalmomsense.com and by following me on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Kanika Chadda Gupta. Now let's dive in to today's episode.
Totally, I can see that. And maybe it happens in Indian culture. Like I said, I've just not encountered anybody at that age group, so I don't remember it. But I can see, because you have the support system, you have someone to have a conversation with. You've seen it, right? It's like everything else in life now when they're talking about, be it women's empowerment or whatever it is, it makes it easier for you to understand. And I can see why that would really be helpful for someone to encounter and even to have a conversation around and talk about it. And I know you're asking me around the feeding experience, but I think for someone who works or goes back to work,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know who really has this conversation. I know they talk about it in maybe the pediatrician's office or the lactation consultant, but most of us lean on our friends. And maybe it's, if the lactation consultants or someone like experts could help, is how do you go back to work with this process? The kind of clothes you wear, because you can get wet, and that's a very embarrassing thing at work. You're trying to go back as a professional and be treated the same but understood. And how do you do this? Because often feeding rooms are either in public, they're there, which is most important, but they're also very often in public places or in corners. So I don't know which is the right location, right? Depends where the organization decides to put it. So how do you provide that support? Organizations can provide it, that's completely immaterial, but for you, because you have a certain audience, how do people have this conversation? Like, where in the baby registry, what do you buy, where do you buy, how do you help them transition if they want to continue to feed that child? And I had colleagues who I worked with who fed that child. I think their kids were probably a year and a half, who were still feeding their babies.
Mm-hmm.
I knew at work. So because it was a completely different experience for me, when I would talk, they were like still feeding their children, and they did it over like their first child, second child, third child. So people continue to manage it through transitions in different places.
Yeah. And I think it's really important for all people to be able to support other people to feed their babies at work, because those people will be better coworkers, better employees. They will get more work done if they are not worried about this one aspect. And I think it's important for all people, even the old white man, to understand how milk supply works. Because when somebody says, no, I can't skip that pumping time, and the boss man is like, I don't understand why not. We have an important client coming in. If somebody sits down with them and says, listen, here's how milk supply works. My baby needs a certain amount of milk over a 24-hour period. The way my body knows to make that milk is if it is removed either by a pump or by my baby. I am here at work and I am not with my baby. So that means I have to remove it from a pump. If I skip a pumping session, my body is not getting that signal that my baby needs the milk. Over time, my body's milk supply will down regulate and I will not have the amount of milk I need for my baby. We have to be mature enough to understand that we are mammals. Mammals produce milk for their babies. That's what breasts are for. People with breasts are in the workplace and they are feeding their babies, and they make very good employees. And we have to be able to care for them. And we have to have these conversations, however awkward they might be, in order for them to feel successful at work.
Yeah, true. I think you defined what a mammal was by what you said. I think that's the textbook definition of it. And also, I would say for the women to hold their own power and ground. And I would say how they should do it is schedule that time in your calendar every day consistently. Block it off. You can make it your private time. There are so many options in office. For whatever reasons, whether you have the conversation in whatever terms, block it off in the calendar. Make it your private time. Like people have, for based on their different leanings, might have a meditation time or a prayer time. People have different things that they need to take care of during the day at work. So block that time and make it consistent. Make and just let your group know if it's something you do regularly, saying, hey, I'm back at work from maternity leave. Have to feed my child, so I have to go and take care of those needs. And every day between 10 to 10:30 and this time to this time, I will be doing this. And you just have the SWAT. And I think once people understand, then they will be supportive of it. Just be a bit open when you come in, because I think those expectations, people want to understand how they can help. And most of us, if you have never encountered it or you haven't had that experience, you do not know what that means. So you should be able to have that discussion with
Yeah,
at least some of your closest friends or allies there. Maybe they can be, spread the message if you are not comfortable spreading the message. So they
exactly.
could
And
speak up for you.
there are two incredible examples of people carving out the time for pumping at work on the Milk Making Minutes. One is with Lori of Mindful Return on episode 63, and the other is with Jen of Mom First on episode 81. If you want to hear an episode which features a very difficult story of trying to pump at work, you can listen to episode 16 with Criselda. All of these are linked in the show notes. even though you ended up transitioning to formula pretty early on, you were thinking about these things. When did you think you would go back into the workforce after you had your kids?
The FMLA policy, I think in most of the US is 12 weeks. And usually they're like, 8 weeks, I think, often, depending on companies, are paid and then, are unpaid. So I took my first 8 weeks and I kept a whole month off because I was planning to transition my son to daycare at some point.
Mm-hmm.
I went back after 8 weeks, but I had like family back home at that point for some time at least. And funny thing is, when I was ready to send him to daycare, I think 2 days before, I was like, wait, why do I need a month for him to get used to it? Because I had this time. So I just bought a ticket to India and went to visit my parents. Like last minute, got on a flight. My sister helped me book it. So I went for that month. So yes, and it's going back is a hard decision, right? For a person. It's most of us do it because we like going back to work. I've been a stay-at-home mom. I've worked. I've done all the different variations you can do. And in all honesty, if you ask me, I would say being a stay at home mom is actually much tougher in a way. Not to press hot buttons for people. Work is hard. Work balancing a kid in daycare, they come back sick. It is horrendous experience, right? It is a lot. But what I mean to say when I say being a stay at home mom was harder is because when I went back to work after I took a 3-year break when I had my second one, and I went back, I told people it was so much easier to transition back because I knew the culture, but because being a stay-at-home mom, all the work is always there on you. And in all honesty, getting a paycheck is an external validation, right? You're getting paid for it. You do this laundry and dishes, and there's always laundry and dishes to do. It's never like empty. It's like a constant running around. But interestingly, I don't know if you know this, and if your listeners know this, the Department of Labor Statistics publishes an annual report on how much a stay-at-home mom is worth, or salary, or what they should be paid. It's 300 and something thousand, by the way, because of all the work they do.
Believe it. I
So
believe
every
it
day, every year,
100%.
it would be like I'd get this report, and I even sent it to a colleague of mine, one of these guys, when we were having this conversation. I said, you should see this, because we were talking about his wife going through the experience, how it was with kids, and just the experience, because it is very hard to understand. So there's always a lot more to be done, as much as we keep continuing to have this conversation. And I'm so glad you're doing this, because you're asking us really our stories around it and our own experiences for people to understand there are different ways to deal with it, and whichever way you choose to make the decision. But also for policymakers and other support systems to understand, saying, hey, how can I do this? And what can I do differently? And even
Yeah.
for doctors to be advocates, right? I mean, you need all your support system, all the people who touch you, to stand up and say, hey, this is not working.
This is one of the reasons I find these conversations to be so important, is because when we begin the seed of doubt that perhaps we are not the parents we thought we could be, because, oh, I can't even feed my baby, I can't increase my baby's weight, that through line continues. It continues into toddlerhood. It continues into the preschool years. It continues into elementary school. The seed of doubt has been planted that I am not a good enough mom. And often these messages come from well-meaning healthcare professionals who do not have the baby feeding training.
Yeah, mom guilt is a real thing. It comes for various reasons, and you don't need extra pressure. I totally get that. And in all honesty, formula is very expensive. And remember, diapers too, but formula is very expensive, right? Pretty fairly expensive proposition. That's why you people end up going to like these big warehouse stores and buying them. And it's hard, and probably not everyone can afford to do that. Every care that can be provided for, if as much as the person has the ability to feed their children from themselves, all the better. And then I remember a good friend of mine saying, she said, pretty much you need none of it. You need a stroller and a car seat because the kid can't go home, and diapers.
Right.
Everything else is a nice to have. You don't
Right.
need these 20,000 things that you get checklist. I was like, okay, that's all I will get then.
Right, exactly. And then as you get to know your baby and your child, you can buy things along the way that you think they actually will use.
Yeah, because for
that
the
was
next
great
4
advice.
years, you'll use them, and then you'll spend time trying to get rid of all, because that's just your room is like cluttered with things. Like, and then you keep it for your second one or your third or whatever, how many ever. And then at some point, you need the space, and
Right.
there's so much stuff. you have. I don't know if babies actually need all the stuff, and we all choose to get them. In the old days, they didn't. So it's, oh yeah. So when you're talking about tradition, I should have mentioned this. So one of the things, and at least from where I come from, which part of India. So we wear this white sari when we get married, like a cotton sari. It's not a grand sari, the actual wedding ceremony. So that white sari often becomes like a cradle. So in most Indian houses in the old days, you had this steel hook on the ceiling, and you would have this cloth thing, and the
Oh.
baby usually sits. If you see all movies, the baby lies in that, and that's how they are like swung back and forth. And so there are like these old, I think they're old blankets and stuff. So when my mother-in-law came, she would bring these small, like these, I guess like a mini quilt in a way, but they were all repurposed things. So even you use this cloth, of course it shreds at some point, and then it becomes like this baby blanket thing. So it gets repurposed in
Oh.
many ways. So I used to have all these little blanket things to wrap the baby in, from this cloth or that sari and this and that, all these tidbits put together, like a 12 by 12 square or 16 by 16 things. And that's what we used all the time in the house. So
That's
that's how a lot of
beautiful.
repurposing gets done in ways.
That's beautiful. I did want to ask, every culture has the foods that they use to, they're called galactagogues. I don't know if you've ever heard that term, but the foods that a nursing parent is supposed to ingest to increase milk supply. Do you know what those foods are from your part of India?
I know what my mother used to call it. I don't recollect the names because I've not really eaten them after. I think so. It was very often these gourd vegetables, which were either mixed with some kind of like pulses cooked a certain way, or I think maybe like sesame and other those kind of ingredients, herbish
Fenugreek, maybe?
ingredients. Maybe fenugreek. It might have been fenugreek also. So there's like certain things, if you want, I'll have to find out. But if there are certain vegetables she would cook, because I remember these gourds would be cooked with this white paste. And that's how she would
Mm.
give me every time to eat. And
Mhm.
it similarly, there are certain things they will tell you not to eat when you're pregnant, right? They say
Oh.
don't eat this, don't eat
Mhm.
that, like a few vegetables. But
And the
this is
list
how.
is quite different from what the OBGYN tells us here not to eat, right?
Yeah, interestingly, in India, if I remember here, the pediatricians tell you no honey, right, for the kids before 1 year. I
Yes,
think
although
that's
that
what
is
they.
changing. That
I
recommendation has changed.
in India, it's not the case. In India, you use honey when the babies are young. So
Uh-huh.
it's a very flip thing. So when I would go to my pediatrician, I think he had a lot of parents who were originally like first generation. So he would understand some things and he'll be like, okay, I know you guys do it like this. And sometimes he would agree and sometimes he would disagree. But he understood that what they tell us may not be the guidelines we are used to at home. So we would, even now, like a lot of things I would do blended, right? I would do Western medicine, I'll do some traditional, I'll just mix and match whatever suits my viewpoint at that point. So
Yeah.
it's very hard to categorize and say that one way is right. And I think he was comparing the Hispanic culture because they do certain things a certain way too, and their foods are different when they're going through this process of
Mhm.
pregnancy and having babies. So a lot of it is inherited knowledge, and probably we'll go back in 100 years and say, oh yeah, that totally made sense. And
Yeah,
we're not just
for
not ready
sure.
to agree right now.
Yeah, exactly. And people always ask, "What should I be eating or drinking to increase my milk supply?" And I always say, "Look, first of all, just keep yourself healthy and fed, eat the foods that you love and enjoy." And I say, "These are the foods that people here in the US eat and drink." But if you were to go to a wide number of places, the list would be totally different. So this is not set in stone. And the most important thing is to remove milk from your body. That's what we know scientifically, that the evidence tells us that is going to give you the biggest bang for your buck to increase your supply. But if you want to drink blue Gatorade, which is like on the list here, that's like what people think increases their supply. Drink blue Gatorade to your heart's content to increase your supply. If that's what oats, a lot of people think you need to eat lots of oats or brewer's yeast. If you like oats and you would like to eat lots of oats to try to increase your supply, great. Just know that is not the primary thing that is going to increase your supply. Feeding your baby and removing milk with either your baby or a pump is going to increase your supply.
Blue Gatorade, huh?
Yeah, isn't that
That sounds.
interesting?
It made me, maybe this. I don't know if this is inappropriate. It made me think of when kids have no idea where milk comes from, and they see the brown cow and they think, okay, chocolate milk. That's what I made. It struck me. I think when I'm thinking about it, ate a lot of goats, and they usually tend to have a lot of water. So I don't know if that had anything to do with it. In addition to all these sesame and these nuts and all these
Yeah.
other fenugreek and other ingredients that they probably had. And I think not necessarily do we eat those foods all the time. There are certain foods that are very specific at that time that are fed. And probably there are different ways that they keep it, right? You stay hydrated, you keep. And I think to your point, you have to pump regularly, or if you're not pumping, if you're breastfeeding, you have to keep a cadence because the first of all, the child needs it and your body needs to be. That's why all the nursing bras, everything are there just so that
Mm-hmm.
you don't show outside, right? If you're not hitting the right schedule.
Exactly. All right. One last personal question about baby feeding. So, when you made that transition to formula, was it difficult to then reduce your milk supply for either child? Did you remember that being difficult? Or did you struggle with engorgement at all or plugged ducts once you transitioned, or it was pretty smooth for you?
I think it was pretty smooth. It was like a sort of a parallel processing of both, and how you'll see the curve come together. I think it just went that way.
Okay.
This
Okay.
was addendum, and slowly it just weaned off. And
Okay.
mine wasn't very long. Mine
Okay.
was probably, for your audience, it's a very different story than what they used to hearing. But because my transition was fairly quick into the formula
Yeah.
space, because I just was not able to feed my children by myself,
Yeah.
and so for
And
whatever reason. So yeah, exactly.
yeah. And did you feel any emotional attachment to letting go of feeding your children your own milk, or did it feel more of a relief to be making that change?
Probably in the beginning, because there is a certain, it's not the expectation, right? There's also research which shows it helps with brain development. There's a lot of things. So you're thinking from various aspects, not just the social and the societal, but also all of these other things, long term impacts when you are talking about not just the pressure, but even the impact of that, because it's supposed to be good. You're wondering whether you're doing the right thing. But eventually, I think, yeah, I'm sure I must have felt something. But at that point, over time, I'm like, okay, this is what needs to be done. Generally, I don't tend to spend time processing things for too long because it can be a downer. So usually I will move past it. I would tell someone, if they're wondering about it, find some friends, find a support, and find a support who is not only one dimensional and not giving you the answer you want. It's okay for you to have a completely different opinion, and they're swaying you one way, and you need to find the other person just so that you feel good about yourself. It's hard enough, your hormones are changing, you're not getting any sleep. I think I would tell my own self before I had kids. When I meet people, young people, and they are talking about time constraints, I totally understand your life's very busy, but I think you fail to realize how much time you had until you've had kids and you're trying to balance everything. And you realize, at least to me, I was like, what did I do with all that time? I do not know. Not that it
I
wasn't
think
good.
that
And
all the time.
I'm like, where did that time go? And on the flip side, it makes you so incredibly productive, because
Right.
when you're working and you're working mom, oftentimes you're trying to maintain a schedule, right? Daycare's close at a certain time, you have to do certain
Mm-hmm.
things. And then people might wonder, if for those who are back at work, you're not spending these long hours. It's probably a good conversation. If you can have it externally, have it. But even for yourself, I think I started to realize I was just much more productive. It's just that I knew what I wanted to do and I was very efficient about it. I didn't have to take so long to do it. I still engaged socially. I did everything, but I just was incredibly efficient. You learn to prioritize what's important and what's not. And you just have to make those decisions. And most importantly, make sure you make time for yourself, no matter
Mm-hmm.
where in this journey you are. Yes, for sure.
Exactly. Thank you so much for sharing those stories. I know it's not typically your purview, but it's so important to hear all the stories. It's important to hear the story of somebody who tried to feed from their body for a couple of weeks and decided, you know what? I'm going to switch the plan because that's what works best for me, and I'm not even going to ruminate on this. I'm just going to move past it because it wasn't working, and that's it. That's what's best for me. So that's an important story for us to hear too.
Yeah, because there'll be enough things for you to worry and feel guilty about in life.
Exactly.
You don't need an extra layer
Right.
to add on.
Yeah, there's a popular meme that passes around in my like social media circles, which is we all stress about breast milk formula. It seems like this huge decision. We work so hard to get them breast milk, and then they all end up eating goldfish off the floor. It's like,
Yes, yes. Cheerios and goldfish. Exactly. The best way to build immunity, right? And it's the same story when people worry about whether their kids are getting potty trained. I'm like, your kid may go in as a 5-year-old to kindergarten, but trust me, after 6 months, they're not doing it. Peer pressure, man. It works in
right,
kindergarten.
right.
They
They
are
will
going to learn to
eventually.
use the restroom.
Right.
At
They
worst
will
case, yeah, you have
eventually.
extra 3 years, but
Right.
everything will work itself out because
It
there is
will.
no way it cannot continue in perpetuity.
Right,
Unlikely.
exactly. Okay, so with that, tell my listeners all about your amazing podcast and what you offer people.
So my podcast is called Women, Career and Life. And I'm going to spell it out because I realize my pronunciation might be heard differently. So it's spelled WOMENCAREER and Life. I started the podcast for two reasons. One was a way to mentor women who are, this is largely for mostly people in corporate. Okay, that's what it's meant for. It's for us, those of you who are stuck, who want to grow, and you're trying to figure out who to ask the questions, what questions to ask, like how do you progress forward. So I share stories, I interview guests and practical advice for them to hit their goals in their career and life. So I do bring the life perspective because as women, this is targeted to women. We are not isolated. Career is not an isolated thing, just like your whole conversation is around. So how do they move forward with this? And I also have an undertone of financial independence because for me, I think as much as possible, everybody should have some financial education and guidance and striving towards that independence because it just gives you the choice. It's not about being selfish or greedy. It's about just giving you choice. So it's telling stories. How do you mentor? Who do you ask the questions? No matter on which level of a structure you are, it's finding those answers to those questions if you're feeling stuck in your career.
That's great. Yeah. Whether you, dear listener, are a parent who is home with your kids or a working parent, or whether you are a lactation professional, this applies to you because even if you are home with your kids, one day your kids will be grown. So if you have the time now to even make slow steps towards what you want to do, once you do not have the intense responsibilities, even if it's taking one class at a time or enrolling in one professional development course at a time. A podcast like Women, Career and Life is so important for any woman because it allows us to be able to think about these things that relate to both our personal lives and our career and realize that it's one thing. They're not two separate things.
And absolutely, because the whole premise that I started with was all about career re-entry. So the first whole season, like 6-7 episodes, is just women have taken a break for whatever reasons, intentional, unintentional, and how they've chosen to come back. Some after 3 years, some after 15 years. Some of them started work in their 40s who have never worked. So
That's
it's showing all these different
amazing.
perspectives. Some who've not fully finished their education but have managed to find, facilitate. And there are, it also interviewing organizations that help women get back and transition this. So if anyone's looking at that, especially because your audience is going through a transition phase, it might be something that might help them no matter, like you said, if you choose now or you choose to come back 20 years later, 40 years later, whenever, to see what services are able to be gathered.
Amazing. And all of the links for your podcast will be in the show notes. And any other links on how people can find you will also be in the show notes so people can just click.
Very good. Thank you,
Awesome.
Lo. This was great.
Yes,
It
really
was a wholly different conversation than I'm used to having, as you said. And I had to dredge up my memories, but yes, it was lovely to chat.
Great. Thank you so much. When I first approached Siricha about coming on the Milk Making Minutes, she wasn't sure she would have anything to say that would benefit my community. And she was hesitant to talk with a lactation consultant about her formula feeding experiences. And for good reason. There can be so much divisiveness. The so-called mommy wars can get intense. And the fed is best versus breast is best narratives are not helpful, especially with so many barriers to human milk feeding. If you want to join a community of people who care about removing these barriers and who listen more than we talk and who care that we all get heard and who are seeking solutions to vast problems in postpartum care, join my Milk Making Minutes community group. This is a place where parents and perinatal professionals and business leaders who want to see change are joining forces to create change. I'll see you there. Bye. Hey, Charlie.
Hi.
So I was wondering, if you ever do have kids, do you think you would prefer to continue working and have somebody else care for them, or would you prefer to stay home for a period of time and care for them?
Definitely keep working.
Why?
Because if I had me as a child, I'd freak and need a break.
That's really good. What, you think you would need like some time away to recoup?
Definitely. All the time I can get.
Do you think that people who take care of other people's children, do you think that's a hard job?
Definitely, especially for me, but I don't really care about them. I just want to have a day off.
Yeah. Do you think they should get paid a lot?
Well, if it's for me, yes. But I can't really afford that if I'm going to have to feed me.
Yeah. You'll have to keep feeding you and your children. That'll get expensive. Awesome. Thank you.